Alright, it's time for the last video in our Poe Price series, and this time we're going to talk about the three Poe Price movies that were somewhat based on Poe, a little bit. The Raven, for sure, and Witchfinder General, and The Haunted Palace, pretty much in name only. But we'll go through The Raven mainly, and we'll just kind of touch on The Haunted Palace and Witchfinder General a little bit, since they're not quite as in it as everything. They're all still officially this Poe series for the most part, but we'll mainly put our focus on The Raven, which feels much more like an adaptation in some sense. So let's go ahead and start with that. It does open up with Price reading the poem, reading the first three verses, which is amazing, obviously. And then we see him, and it is like the poem come to life, more or less. We see Price sitting alone, and he's mourning Lenore, and it's been like 2 years. And then there is a tapping sound, as if someone gently rapping, and he finds a raven at his window, and just as it feels like everything is directly in order, and this is exactly how we've seen it before, despite the tone of, there's like kind of a comedic score playing, and he keeps bumping into the telescope as he's moving around, but other than that, it's pretty much what we expect it to be when we visualize the poem, more or less. We maybe seen it a bit more gothic looking in our minds and darker, but a lot of the elements are here, and it's Price, so we're feeling all those vibes. And then the Raven goes to open his mouth after Price has suggested, is this related to Lenore's? Can you tell me anything about Lenore? And instead of the Raven saying, nevermore, it is Peter Lorre's voice saying, how the hell should I know? And that will completely send us on a different path, but what I do like about this is that it is a comedy right up front. And we talked about it at the very beginning, when we talked about House of Usher, and pretty much everything else we've talked about in this series, is the idea of being able to have Poe's spirit in here, but also not being direct adaptations, or bringing in other aspects of Poe to make their own thing. So this right away sets up that this is them kind of doing their own thing, but they haven't completely abandoned the spirit of Poe either. And I think the idea of us seeing in this series the darkness that they are capable of doing with this material, it seems like a very conscious decision to do a comedy. It's not a comedy by accident. And so I think that ends up coming through when you see the whole product, and like I said, and the way they can balance that, but also feel like they haven't left the spirit of Poe behind throughout it, is something that I think makes this movie so appealing for the fans of what Corman and Price were doing. Not to mention, this is another one of those perfect casts, where we have Price and Laurie, but we also have Karloff, and we have a very young Nicholson, who he was still just starting out in Corman's playground here. And obviously, any magic that you would expect from that. Nobody's wasted. Everybody has a significant part and really gets to show what they can do, which I feel like is something that would happen a lot more nowadays than it would back then, when you really gave everybody the chance to show off, especially when you had all these legends and a future legend all here together, and it comes together into this really gloriously seasonal movie that's always fun to come back to. And I also love when we're talking about the sort of, still there's a dark vibe to it despite all the comedy, when it's revealed that Price is a sorcerer. Now, we do see him doing like the hand manipulation they talk about later. He does start off that way, but it really kicks in when he takes Laurie downstairs, and he just seems more or less, with the exception of that opening, like a normal person, and we're not quite sure why Laurie came to him. And then we see what downstairs is, and there's a skeleton hanging, and there's cobwebs everywhere, there's potion bottles, there's spell books. He's even grossed out by some of the things he has, like the box of eyes, and the idea of the dead man's hair. And so to see a sorcerer played by Price, no less, as somebody that's very much in his element here, but also is grossed out by his own things, and not to mention the fact that we're so used to seeing Price a certain way in these, where like he's the commanding presence and he's like front and center. And here, he's being bossed around so much by Peter Lorre, sometimes Peter Lorre in Raven form, and that's just very amusing in itself. But at the same time, even despite all this, we get some of this prime Poe imagery, like at one point when the Raven is perched on a skull while Price is trying to figure out what this potion and spell is. And that's, like, you can just see the balance and the love for all of this, like the love for the material and just the genre itself, and just making something that's worthy of all of these legendary names behind it and in front of it. And they even throw in stuff that's still super macabre, but put this funny twist on it, like when he needs more dead man's hair, so he has to go downstairs to his father's crypt and open it. And in a scene that otherwise doesn't really come back as far as his father being briefly resurrected here, except to maybe foreshadow when Karloff takes his form a little later, but at the end. But when we see his father wake up and he grabs his arm and he says, "Beware," and then the next scene, Price and Lorre are talking about it, but they're just so nonchalant and say, like, well, that was unexpected, wasn't it? It's like, yes, most unexpected. And it's just the nonchalant way they approach that, like when they look at Lenore's body after Lorre claims that he's seen her at Karloff's castle, and when they see this, and we've seen his father, and his father's been dead for 20 years, and he's just a little shriveled up. Like, for being dead 20 years, he doesn't look terrible, or like you would expect anyway. Lenore has only been dead 2 years and looks, Lenore in quotes, looks all mangled and decomposed, and they're just so casual, like, yep, that's her, and then they just go about what they were doing. And I love the comedic touch of that, and how that can even add to the macabre nature of it, of treating something like that so nonchalantly. Can be equally funny and just give you this sort of spooky feeling. So I really love the way they were able to balance that. And then, obviously, they're going to throw in some slapstick. Like, it's pretty, like, we're in that light era of the early 60s, so it's going to have, like, it's going to have the playful score, it's going to have the playful slapstick, but you can also throw stuff in, like what Nicholson's doing here, where Nicholson is interesting to watch here, because, once again, we know the actor he's to become, but also there's the moment where he just goes, like, full-blown manic when they're in the carriage, and it's when they're supposedly being stopped by Karloff to get to the castle, and this moment where we see Manic Nicholson before Manic Nicholson was a thing is really fun, especially when you see the other sides of this, where when it's not this scene and we see the Nicholson we're really going to know in the future, he's playing such a timid character and such an exasperated character being wrapped up in all this, so that's really fun to see. And then, of course, with Karloff, his character is built up for quite a bit of the movie, and we know that he's in it, so we're kind of building him up as the audience also. And then when he has that entrance after all this, despite all the other legends and future legend here, there's still just this weight that he carries when he enters and comes down the stairs. And it's like, even though we've been looking at Price and Lorre the whole time, there's still this moment of, holy shit, it's Karloff, and it's amazing. And I love that feeling, and that's like the feeling you can only get in movies like this of this particular time, particularly from that Corman era of things. Also in this, where he was like really into the whole building his own sandbox and having all these people come in that were legends, and then all the people that were created within his movies and went on to do these huge, incredible things. Nicholson's just the tip of the iceberg. That's just a whole list you can go down from, like, Coppola to Demme to all those people. And look, what's interesting too about this is seeing Lorre and Price and Karloff in the same room, and everybody's kind of an antagonist to each other, and we all know that they're capable of magic, or at the very least, Price and Karloff. But for a long time, there's just a battle with words, and then eventually it gets into a battle with magic. And I love the fact that they're just not wasting the talent. Like I can't express, especially now when we see that so often, how great it is to have the presence of all these people and to just not waste it is something this movie is so good at. And we get, more story turns later, like the Lenore twist, which you could say, betrays the despair that comes from the poem and stuff like that. But as far as, the movie needing another little turn here, it's already a slim movie at like 85 minutes. Why not throw this in? We've had, the betrayals before. It's kind of a theme in the adaptations of these. And we've got her not only betraying Price by faking her death and going to Karloff, but the fact that she just straight up tells Karloff to his face with no issues that she only did this because of Karloff's wealth and power. And just setting that character up as kind of the ultimate antagonist to everybody that's here. So that's a fun thing to throw in also. And it does seem like it becomes more light as it goes, even when they're like dueling to the death. There's this, like I said, there's the dark moment where he turns into his father and kind of taunts him a little bit, but then that turns into, he's just pelting him with eggs, and he seems to kill Price multiple times over, but he's always concocted some sort of ruse, and there's something very playful about it. It is actually a G-rated movie, so taking in that light quality and taking in the fact that it's so deliberate that it's a comedy, and the fact that we know the darkness they're capable of, what we were talking about before, that's where I feel like knowing that those two things can coexist, and that even if one movie favors one genre over another, it seems, this one feels like a pretty nice blend of having all of the stuff we'd want in a Poe adaptation, but being able to make it light and funny throughout it. And I feel like this one really succeeds in that. So this is obviously a really fun time, and it's, once again, even if it's not like the vibe of Poe that you get when you actually read some of the stories, even there is at the start of the poem there is a moment where he's kind of amused with the Raven for a little bit before he goes into anger and then ultimately despair and hopelessness. But there is that moment where it does feel like when he's amused by the Raven and the fact that it talks is where they were like, this is what we're gonna take and kind of run with. And so it feels like the spirit is always there. So I really appreciate this one. So as far as the Haunted Palace goes, this is another one that we're in Corman's world. This is the last one we're going to talk about that's in Corman's world. And yeah, there is a poem that is called The Haunted Palace that Poe wrote and is in House of Usher, The Fall of the House of Usher. So we kind of touched on it before. This one, however, is basically an adaptation of the Lovecraft story, The Case of Charles Dexter Ward. And by basically, I mean that's exactly what it is. So, and it just happens to have the Haunted Palace's name on it so that they could kind of put it into this building franchise, if you want to call it that, of what they were doing. I think by this point I had heard that Corman was kind of over the whole Poe adaptation thing, or at the very least doing this particular series, and kind of wanted to keep branching out and do other things, like Lovecraft, for instance. So, as far as this goes as a movie, it does feel very much of this haunted 60s horror movie vibe we've been talking about this whole series. And this one kind of feels like the personification of that atmosphere we've been talking about this whole time. Where we start off, and there's a good old-fashioned revenge curse that's put on a town. We have Price from 110 years ago, and we see what appears to be, it feels like a climax, this beginning it does. And then when he's ultimately executed and puts this revenge curse on the town, we do jump 110 years where Price now plays a descendant and he's come back into the town. And I like the way we have the other actors still here, and we get all the stuff we love. We get fog, we get warnings, we have a character who doesn't believe in the supernatural that is absolutely going to believe in the supernatural by the end of it. We've got a tavern that they go into and everybody turns and stares and just stops. And it's all this. Lon Chaney Jr. is the caretaker. There's a ghostly portrait. This literally has everything you could ask for in a movie of this era when that's what you're looking for. We especially talked about this in The Pit and the Pendulum, where it really found those kind of vibes, but this one is just overflowing with all the stuff that's just classic horror and everything you look for. This is like, not just for Corman, not just for Poe adaptations, not just for Vincent Price. If you have anybody that's like, what's a movie I could start with in general to get me into this particular era of horror, this would probably be one of the movies I would point to first, for sure. And the way that they even try to not immediately put, like, ghosts necessarily in it, where they talk about how the town isn't haunted by ghosts, it's haunted by fear and guilt. And it's like, even when it's not something like your typical everyday ghosts, I still love how much the feeling is still there. That classic haunted feeling is still very much over this town. And that's when we start seeing the people with the deformities, like the little girls that walk out. And then there's that moment when they're together in the street and they start getting surrounded by these people just approaching them. The way they just creep into the street. And you could say that it maybe takes away a little bit how obvious the makeup is, but I almost feel like, especially through this like 60s lens, like that grainy film look, there is something that's like just as unsettling, if not more so, about the fact that it is kind of obvious makeup. There's something that almost makes it seem even more unnatural as they come creeping out into the street. So that's, I never really mind that. And yeah, speaking of the Pit and the Pendulum, we do have Price basically getting to play two roles again, where he had a previous character who died years ago, who's kind of possessing, in a way, his present-day character, and him getting to play those personality changes, and then the way this escalates, and he steals a corpse, he goes on a killing spree, and it's, yeah, all the stuff, it feels like everything, it's interesting where this goes in chronological order, because it feels like it's the culmination of everything we've talked about up to this point, when actually it was a bit earlier than where we're talking about now. After the movie, it's before some of the movies we've already talked about. But, yeah, and as far as, like, it having any Poe in it, yeah, there is as usual, as with all the rest, there is a quote from the poem at the end, but that's about it. But regardless, it's still a perfect seasonal movie to me, and, like I said, a perfect personification of that 60s horror atmosphere that is everything you would want in a movie like this. So again, with Witchfinder General, it is allegedly based on the Conqueror Worm, but it's really not. There's even, I guess there's editions of the movie that, once again, end with a quote or a reading. I think it's a reading by Price of the Conqueror Worm. I will tell you, the only version of this that I've seen is in the Vincent Price collection from Scream Factory, and this version does not have the reading of the Conqueror Worm, so, but it is listed, it has the Conqueror Worm's poster on the back for the movie, and it says Witchfinder General, aka the Conqueror Worm. But, as far as I've seen, the Conqueror Worm has absolutely nothing to do with this movie at all. So, once again, it's actually based on something else. It's based on Witchfinder General by Ronald Bassett. So, but again, we're just going to throw it into the mix because they did. So we'll just touch on it briefly. It starts to another Price movie that would come a little bit later, I think, Cry the Banshee, of a supposed witch being dragged to her execution. And this very, atmospheric opening where we see, the gallows being built, and then we see this whole execution. And it actually, Price actually enters the movie relatively late. I feel like it's like 20 minutes in or something, and the movie's not even an hour and a half, I don't think. But he comes in a bit late. It mainly is centered for a little bit on this ill-fated love story between this soldier and his wife-to-be, Sarah. And what happens here when Price and his crew come in and the town is pillaged and Sarah is ultimately raped. And it's like, when you look at what's going on here, even with the 60s restrictions, it does feel like there is a relentless nature to this movie. Yeah, we were getting in like the late 60s and things were getting much more explicit compared to previously, and you were really starting to be able to show a lot more. But like, even then, I still feel like this movie is more relentless than you expect it to be when you think about which era it's from. And you get, like, even the character of Stern, I think it is, who's basically just cruel for the sake of it, and he's one of those like henchmen that essentially becomes a major antagonist throughout, especially when he and Price go separate ways and he's not on Price's leash anymore. And we get all these variations of torture. There's where they drop them over the bridge and they suspend them in water, and the people that don't drown are then just hanged. There's the really brutal cut where they survive the bridge, so Price says, take them to the tree. And when he says take them to the tree, it's even, I was saying, like, they show a lot. Even though we don't actually see the hanging, I feel like it's almost just as brutal when he says take them to the tree, and it just abruptly cuts to them already dead in the trees. And that's something that's really hard-hitting when it happens. And later on, when there's the woman that's tied to the ladder and just slowly lowered into the fire, it's like the brutality really comes through in this. And then to see him, like, take pride when he gets that general title, or at least it seems like pride. And there's times where just you think it's going to cut away, and then it just doesn't. Like, we just sort of keep going and keep seeing. And so, naturally, after Sarah's raped and the soldier returns, it turns into a revenge movie, and it kind of feels like this is a real taking off point. We've had, like, the brutality in the first half, and now we have the repercussions of that in the second half. And there's that good scene, especially when he's with Sarah, and he, like, vows his revenge is a really good scene. And then it goes off. There's the great moment. What's interesting about this movie is that it becomes surprisingly kind of unpredictable in a lot of different moments as it goes towards its climax. One I particularly like is when he first interacts with Stearns, and you think it's going to be one of those moments where, oh, they don't know who the other is, or one knows who the other is, but the other one doesn't, and it's like, how long are they going to talk before they figure it out? They don't even go that route. It just isn't they immediately know, and they immediately start fighting, and it becomes a whole thing. So swerves like that are fun. And that's one where it's like, I feel like the other way could have been a really, really great scene too, but I do like the sort of subversion that we're expecting that'll be the scene, for them to just immediately start fighting, so that's fun. And what's especially interesting about this is one of those movies that actually convinces you that there's a very likely chance that evil will win. And I guess in a way it does, but by that I mean characters, like protagonists, will die and Price will live. So the fact that Price is dealt with does feel like this moment of, well, it goes in that direction of evil didn't win necessarily, but this moment where after Price has been killed in front of him and he didn't get to do it, there's that moment where when all the antagonists of the movie and Price were just about the cruelty, you get the vibe in these last moments with the soldier that it might have just been about the revenge, and that's the note that we end on. So we still end up in a dark place, and it does still feel like the soldier has been conquered many ways over, as is Sarah. But yeah, so it's kind of it's not so much that evil wins, it's that kind of nobody wins. But yeah, but I get evil is vanquished in a way, but I like how gray that is. So that's something that's unexpected, and on top of the many other unexpected things in this movie. So I still very much appreciate this one. I know it has like kind of a cult following now. But if you go into it looking for the Conqueror Worm, we talked about the Conqueror Worm when we talked about Ligeia, and I was comparing it to the Tomorrow speech in Macbeth, which I feel like it resembles a lot. Yeah, that's not really in this. So, and I'm curious how like his reading of it plays at the end of it when you see that particular version of it. But like I said, I have not. So I've only seen this one that is strictly Witchfinder General, despite what the box for the DVD set says. But yeah, so I think that's going to be it for this. So this is the end of our Poe Price series. Hopefully I didn't butcher anything too much for the super hardcore Poe and or Price fans, but yeah, I did find this fun to do and go back to these movies and really explore them and look at them, and especially this time of year, they're just really great ones to come back to, so it should be a tradition for most people. So I'll leave this at this, and we're probably in the final stretch of the month at this point. So we've got a bunch of other stuff coming that you probably know about at this point or are expecting. I've mentioned in the other videos, so I'll just end this here. So until the next thing, I think that's it.